Hello, and thank you for joining us for today's program, Fueling HR with Data. This event is part of SHRM's webcast series. You can learn about upcoming and on-demand programs from our e-newsletters and the webcast homepage at shrm.org/webcast. SHRM thanks today's program sponsor, Achievers, for providing support to make this webcast available to the HR community. Today's program will explore what data science is and how it can be applied to HR. You'll hear how the scientific method can be a guiding light for your HR initiatives, and you'll also learn about common pitfalls and misconceptions you need to be aware of to keep a realistic view of your insights. To lead our program, we're pleased to welcome Tanya Stemberger from Achievers. Ms. Stemberger is a data scientist with Achievers. Before joining the Achievers team, she worked mining large digital exhaust data sets and building predictive models for clients in finance. And before that, she led a team of analysts doing more traditional market research and analytics in the med tech field. With introductions complete, I'm pleased now to turn over the webcast microphone to our speaker, Ms. Tanya Stemberger.
Thank you. Thank you, Mike, for that introduction, and thank you all of you for tuning in. It's a real pleasure to be here to be able to talk to you a little bit about how you can be fueling HR with data. And just before I get into that too much, I want to talk to you a little bit about how I view our data and who we are at Achievers. So from a data science, you might get a very different answer if you were to ask somebody else at our company what it is that we do. But from a data science perspective, I see what we do as being a social network. We are a place where people come within an organization to be giving each other recognition. So it's a social network where the only thing that you can post are positive things about the other people on your team. We're also an engagement tool, so a tool to measure engagement, but also to be impacting engagement through the recognition tool itself and through the listen tool. And that means that we are able to, or potentially able to do things like impact engagement, performance, turnover, etc. And lastly, we're also a global marketplace, which can be really interesting from the data perspective because it means that in some ways, some of our problems can kind of seem like we're a bank. So it's good fun every single day. But I bring this up because I want to talk to you a little bit about what we do with regards to data science. And the way that I have been looking at this for the last year and a half or so is that we are trying to create a culture of science literacy and data-driven decision-making for ourselves, our clients, and our community by empowering everyone with the tools and the knowledge to make good use of what the data and the science are telling us. So that's a ton of words. So let me make that a little bit easier and just say that we like to use data to be smarter. We want to use this data to make all of us smarter through ourselves as well as through the platform itself. So being through the platform, there are kind of three different ways, not just through the platform, but three different ways that data science is being applied. And that's through client-facing data science, platform-facing data science, and industry-facing data science. So the reason I'm here to talk to you today is because it's really important to me as part of my community, this wider community of people who are working in HR, that we be giving back into that about things like how to use your data, how to think about your data, but also what the data that we see is telling you. So that we can be advancing the field not just in terms of your capabilities, but also your understanding of how engagement works and how recognition works and all those good things. So why should you talk to me? Well, you've heard a little bit about my background, my more recent background, but prior to that, I also worked in academia for a little less than a decade. And during that time, I worked with a variety of people on a variety of projects, but I was working in communication as well. Nowadays, I do all of those things that I just described, the client, platform, Achievers-facing stuff, as well as the industry-facing stuff. So what that means to you, I think, is that I'm working with HR professionals every single day. Our business here at Achievers is to make your business better. Your business as HR professionals is what we're working towards. So that means that I am consulting continuously with people who are in HR or HR analytics, and I'm hearing those challenges. So even though I'm not there on the floor, I'm not there to be able to see the things that you see, I am here to do my best to help. And today, the way that I hope to be able to help is to talk a little bit about what data science is, how that relates to HR, and then we're going to spend quite a bit of time digging into some of the things that you can do in order to start using that data in a conceptual way. If we have time towards the end, I will also talk a little bit, we'll zoom out a little bit to talk about strategy and thinking about strategy, but my instinct here is that we may not be able to get to all of that, though you will have the slides so you can peruse those on your own. So let's get started. What is data science? Well, if you ask 10 different data scientists to define data science, you will probably get roughly 10 subtly different answers. However, usually you will get things that include some of these words, but most importantly, it will include that it is an interdisciplinary field that usually uses big data to do science and make predictions. But now I've introduced a bunch of additional jargon here, so let's go over some of that jargon. What is big data? Big data traditionally tends to mean that it is, there's a lot of it, of course, but also that it is coming in fast. It's coming in at the speed of the internet, and that there is a lot of different types of it. It's not just counts or numbers. It could also be dates. It could be video. It could be audio. It could be text. It's lots of very rich data as well. So it's kind of a traditional definition, but I think that a more useful definition a lot of the time is to think about it as you have big data when your small data tools don't work. So if you have an Excel file and that Excel file won't open or it won't run the analysis that you need it to do, you might have a big data problem. And that's when you need to start thinking about using big data tools like databases or Python or R in order to start approaching those bigger data problems. Now, all that being said, big data is not necessarily required in order to be able to do good science. So let's talk a little bit about science. Science is this cyclical process that begins with an observation, leads to questions and hypotheses, that you then do experiments and get some analyses out of the other side, so that you get results, and then those results and the interpretations turn into new observations. And at any time in this cycle, you may be doing things to refine that process. So you may be doubling back in order to be able to do it. The reason there's an asterisk there in the bottom about explore and experiment is because a difference between more traditional science and the kind of science that we often do when we have these really large existing data sets is that you are mining the data instead of doing new tests. That's not always true. Sometimes we're really lucky and we're able to do both. But if you are mining the data, then you might be coming at it with a slightly different approach. So explore or experiment. Okay, and then the next piece is predict. What I mean by that is that we use the data that we've got in order to either predict new data, to create new data that we either don't have yet, or to understand the data that we've got, or to create information to describe the data in a new way so that we're able to use that data to do something else. So the example that I've got here on the page, we've got the blue data for period 1, 2, and 3, but we don't have the orange data. So we're fitting some kind of model based off of periods 1, 2, and 3 in order to predict what would happen in period 4. Then in the next one, below that in the middle, you see that we've gotten the data now for period 4, and that allows us to fit a new model that includes periods 1, 2, 3, and 4 in order to get a better estimate of what period 5 is going to be, and then that's what we see in period 5. And then you go on, so on and so forth. So this is where you are using the data that you've got in order to predict new data, and then as you get more data, you're able to iteratively improve the model as well as look back at what you did before and see how effective it was in the past. Okay, so that's what predictions kind of are in a nutshell, or one type of predictions. The other thing that I really want to talk about is this idea of interdisciplinary. So data science is an interdisciplinary field. It's pulling from these, you can conceptualize it like this, that it's pulling from these 3 broad areas where you've got data and scripting, math and stats knowledge, and I think that those are the areas that people really think about, but it's also this area of substantive expertise. Those are things like the soft skills to be able to communicate, to be able to understand what's important and communicate back what the insights are. But also, really key, is that it is the place where we are able to get the information required to be able to ask good questions and define the metrics that actually matter. If you don't have that substantive expertise, all of the rest of the stuff that we're doing is not going to be useful. It's not going to lead to change. It's not going to lead to insight, or it might lead to insights that nobody cares about. So this area of substantive expertise is really, really critical. And I think that this is important for an HR audience in particular, because oftentimes our clients, our people in HR, are working on a smaller team, and you need to be relying on that circle of excellence. You maybe are sitting in this area of substantive expertise. You have spent your career really working with these people and knowing people very, very well, and now you're learning enough to be able to talk the talk to make connections to these other two groups. Or maybe you're also trying to learn those skills in those other groups, or those other two areas, so that you can do it yourself. So that you can be sitting in that middle part there. But if you're not, then you can really rely on your circle of excellence to be able to pull in and still accomplish really great data science as a team. Okay, so let's talk about why you should care. You in particular should care about data science. Well, when I think about HR, and when I talk about HR, I often think about it in terms of this employee life cycle. People are moving from when they started a company, or even before when they started a company, their impression of what the company is going to be like to work at, all the way through to however it is that they decide to leave. Maybe it's to retirement, or maybe they're being let go, or maybe they find another position, and everything in between. But it's not really just that. It's not just a life cycle. It's all of the things that are happening. It's not just life cycle, it's more like life. HR is really about the people itself. And that means that it's all these other things. It's performance management, engagement, learning and development, diversity and inclusion, safety, wellness. All of these things come together and more in order to describe what it is that HR is doing for a company. And all of these things are producing data and are interconnected by their data. So those are the places where you're going to be able to pull information out in order to start thinking about what can you do within recruiting with the data that you've got, but also how do you understand how recruiting is related to onboarding, or how does orientation relate to engagement or to retention? How does your career progression relate to safety? All of these things can be interconnected if you have the data to be able to look at it. Okay, but how do you start? How do you really get into this? And it can be really tricky, I think, for people to get started, because unlike this fellow on the screen here, the kinds of questions that people have tend to start off being quite fuzzy to start. They're a little bit vague. It's like people will come to me and say, Tanya, tell me why engagement is important. And I'm like, well, that's not a data question. Let's think about what engagement is doing for you at your company. Or tell me about why I should care about recognition. I'm like, okay, well, let's dig into this. How do I turn this vague idea into something that's going to be concrete, something that's going to be really, that I can really start to dig into as a data question? And the way that I do this, and I think most people do this, is to begin by rooting all questions in a business need or a business question. That way, you always know that when you get to the bottom, when you get to the business insight, you're going to be able to loop it back in order to answer that question and make some sort of actionable change or some sort of useful insight for the business. So you start with a business need or a business question, which leads to a data question, and that data question will tell you what the correct data to use for that question is. So you don't want to be saying, okay, I'm interested in engagement, and I say, okay, what are you using engagement for? Is engagement important to you because of retention? Okay, let's look at your engagement scores versus retention and see if there is a relationship between those things, a statistically relevant relationship between those things. I'm not going to come to you and say, you're interested in engagement? Okay, go measure the height of all of the people in the company. That's not relevant to retention or to engagement, or hopefully it's not relevant to either of those things. Though we might see spurious relationships once in a while. Anywho, so you get to the correct data to use, and that leads us then to data insights, which are going to be actually useful as business insights because we rooted it in that business need. Okay. So now that you kind of know where to start, let's talk about what this might look like in a little bit more detail. And that brings me to this idea of analytics advancement. When people talk about analytics, it means a lot of different things. It can mean a ton of different things. So I've broken analytics down into base analytics, like the core starting place of analytics, and just called that analytics. And then there's advanced analytics and predictive analytics, as well as machine learning. So the first part is analytics. And we're going to spend probably the most amount of time here because I think that this is probably one of the most important areas, and because it's where all of these other things ultimately need to start. So analytics is it's the base. It's where you start. So it's things like descriptive analytics that are going to tell us what happened in the past, and that way, when we're looking at it, we're going to be able to make some hypotheses, come up with some ideas about what might have been going on. So this is, again, always your starting place. Even if you're going to go on to do additional things in advanced analytics, you always start by looking through the data that you've got, cutting it into different pieces. Maybe you look at a snapshot and break it down by proportions. Look at a snapshot and see at this time, how many people do we have across all of these different countries? What is the retention rate across different states? That sort of thing. Or you could be looking at it across time. As a company, how are we doing in terms of our time to close ads over time? And that's not going to tell you why something is happening, but it will tell you what. And for many people, that's enough. That's enough to get the kinds of insights that you need in order to be able to do what you need to do as an HR group and in order to support other areas of the business. However, when you want to start moving forward into other areas, you're going to start thinking about advanced analytics. We aren't done yet here, though, with analytics. I would really like to talk a little bit more about metrics and how those metrics or KPIs can relate to strategy. I think that this is a really important topic. I'm not the only person who thinks this is an important topic, because earlier this year, this article came out in the Harvard Business Review that was about how metrics could be undermining your business. So this isn't just HR, but the same things apply to a subdivision of a company as it would to a larger part of the company. So I think it's still really, really important to be thinking about. So if you have a chance, I do recommend reading this article. I think that it's valuable. I'm going to be focusing in on one concept that they present that kind of explains why this issue occurs, or what the issue that occurs is. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about how we can approach building metrics in a way that will hopefully help us to be allowing them to support metrics instead of become metrics, which is, of course, what the problem is. So the problem that they present is called surrogation. And surrogation occurs when you have this idea of an interest area, and maybe it's a tough, vague sort of interest area. I think that should feel very familiar to anybody who's working in HR, because a lot of the problems or questions that we have to do with humans seem kind of vague, or can seem kind of vague. So this interest area that's sort of vague, but just because it's vague doesn't mean we're not going to try, doesn't mean we're not going to tackle it. So we come up with some sort of strategy in order to cover that. Then we think, okay, well, we need to have some sort of pulse on this. So we come up with some metrics that are going to inform it. Hopefully a bunch of metrics, but at least one, and that's going to help us understand the problem and see how that problem is progressing over time. However, the problem comes in when that metric over time drops down to, instead of being hopefully several, down to being just one metric, and people start to think of the metric as being equally as important as the strategy itself. Nobody's really noticing this happening. It's just insidiously becoming bigger and more important, so that instead of a happy workforce, we're thinking about this particular single metric that has to do with happiness, and nothing else, nothing about benefits or ergonomics or time off or work-life balance. Like, none of those other things matter. Instead, we're only going to think about I don't know, some specific thing that people come up with, and as a result, the strategy ends up becoming less and less important. Instead, we're focusing on that metric because people are being rewarded potentially based off of this metric, or that metric is being supported, and then the other things sort of fall away. Okay, so that's the problem. And if you go back to that article, if you get a chance to pick up that article and read it, that will go over a number of ways that you can approach this problem. I'm going to talk specifically about how to think about metrics. So metrics are data that is being collected in order to answer a really specific question. They are going to be informing the strategy, but they themselves are not the strategy. So a way to come at this is through the scientific framework, and we here at Achievers have come up with a sort of simplified version of the scientific framework that looks like this. And this simplified version of the scientific framework includes observe and think, measure, insight, act, and then iterate. So this is you see something and you come up with a question, a very specific question, and then you go measure something that's relevant to that question. You look at it in a way that's going to be able to bring you some insight, and then you take action based off of what you've learned. And now that you've taken action, you need to go back and iterate because you've changed the system and something might have changed as a result. Hopefully something has changed as a result. So let's use this in order to build some metrics. So you start with observing and thinking about your interest area. This comes back to this substantive expertise that you've got. And if you don't have it, then you are about this one specific area. You know, maybe you're in Comp and Ben and this is about learning and development. So if you don't know a lot about it, then you go research, you go learn, you go talk to those colleagues, again, relying on your circle of excellence in order to hone in on this interest area and break it down into pieces that make sense. Subdivide it into approachable areas. Otherwise, it's going to be too big in order to come at. Then you come up with a number of really specific questions about each of those sub-areas. And those questions are going to help you to formulate how you are going to approach this. And once you've got those questions, you then measure something about each of them. And when you've got the data, you've now got these measurements and each of these values. Those values can either in and of themselves become a metric or a KPI, or can be combined in various ways in order to create a KPI. And again, the best metrics are always ones that pull from a number of different locations. That way it isn't a single lever that's being pushed or pulled in order to get that pulse. This then leads to you do something with the insight that you've got in order to look at it, understand what's happening. That guides what sort of action that you're going to take, and then you iterate again. You go back. Now that you have changed the system, you go back and you think about it again. How are you going to approach this? What are your new questions? So bringing that back to this framework from before where you were rooting things in business needs, when you're thinking about a metric, it's much the same thing, except now instead of thinking about what is the correct data to use, you're thinking about what is the correct data to collect, measure, and make into metrics. And then down the line, it's not just about business insights, but it's also about the strategy that those insights can help you understand and inform in order to have it develop in the future in ways that make sense. Okay, so advanced analytics now. Advanced analytics or regular analytics are looking at the past, and advanced analytics also tends to be looking at the past, but it's looking at it in a more rigorous statistical way. Previously, we were looking at what, and now we want to start asking something about why, or we're asking what in a way that's going to be able to tell us whether or not there are real relationships that are happening there, or whether or not it's us as humans being like, hey, that kind of looks like a line. This is going to tell us whether or not that relationship is actually real. So you're going to be using this to do things like ask about differences between groups or populations, or see whether or not there are relationships between two or more variables. You can also use it to take a more scientific approach. So again, if you're looking at retrospective data, there are a number of different things that you can do with that, but you can start asking questions that will give you a little bit more information about causation if you were able to do things with a more scientific approach. So this might be, for example, if you are able to have a limited rollout of some sort of new, let's say it's a package. You roll this package out to one population and see how that impacts that one population and compare it to other populations to see whether or not there's a real impact of that sort of thing. So when you have the opportunity to do this, it's an exciting way to be able to approach it in a way that really gives you some strong evidence of those relationships existing in a particular direction, which I think is particularly cool. However, most of the time what we're doing is data mining. So this is using these advanced methods, methods to be able to look for these relationships. Alternatively, you can also be using things like network analysis or that sort of thing that will give you a new way of looking at the same data, but you're still doing analytics, or that core baseline analytics of seeing how things are changing over time, or whether or not there are just absolute differences between groups, but looking at it in a new way. So I know that that was kind of vague, so I want to talk about a little bit more, give you a couple of more concrete examples. So in this case, I was looking at, for one particular company, I had 4 different groups, or I was thinking about this question in 4 different groups. The question was whether or not there is an impact of being a user of the platform, again for this one particular company, on whether or not the people at that company were likely to leave the company. And I approached this by breaking the data down into 4 different groups. Were you a user of the platform? Yes or no? And did you leave the company? Yes or no? So 4 groups. Yes, you're a user of the platform and you left, or yes, you're a user of the platform and you didn't leave, or no, you're not a user and you stayed or you left. So 4 groups in total. I'm not going to show you all of those 4 different plots. I'm just going to show you the one. But the kind of analysis that I did here looks at if we were to if there was no relationship between whether or not you stayed at the company and whether or not you were a user of the platform, we can make an estimate of how many people there should be in that group. And that's what the expected bar is in green. Then the blue is the number that we actually observed. So this here is the group that left and were non-users. And what we see here is that non-users were 300% more likely to leave than we would expect by chance for this particular company, 300%. So if you're interested, this was a chi-squared analysis. Okay, one more. For this study, I had a recognition rate in the period of time leading up to whether or not somebody left a company, or in the most recent 3 months prior to pulling the data. So it's the frequency with which you were receiving a recognition through the platform. And what we saw was that the average recognition rate, if you still were with the company, was much, much higher than if you left the company. But I think the most interesting thing that came out of this analysis was that if you left the company because you were asked to leave, or if you left the company because you chose to leave, the average recognition rate between those 2 groups was identical. So the takeaway for this particular company, this is just one company, but the takeaway for this particular company was that really you should be treating people like you want them to stay. Okay, let's talk a little bit about predictive analytics and machine learning. So in many ways, these things are quite similar. Predictive analytics in some ways is a bit of a subset of machine learning, except often when we talk about machine learning, it's usually about how we're going to embed this in something else, but they often use very similar tools. So I'm not going to get too much into that, and I'm going to be talking about them as though they are essentially the same thing. And we talked about this way at the beginning when I showed you those plots where you were looking at the data in the past and using that in order to predict something that you don't have, something in the future. So that is the predictive piece from that. There are 2 main categories that we talk about. One is supervised and one is unsupervised. And I chose this picture because I felt like, if I have to have a supervisor, I will choose my cat. My supervisor is fabulous. I love you. But anyway, supervised is when we have data about what the outcome is going to be. So for example, you might have data about what a particular person's engagement is like, or you might have data about what a particular person's duration of time that they spent in a role, or duration of time that they spent at a company. And that could be an outcome that you have that you might want to be able to predict. Unsupervised is when we don't have anything. We're trying to see patterns in the data and see if we can predict those patterns without knowing what the pattern is going to be or what exactly we're looking for. So if you're thinking that's a very complicated problem, you're absolutely correct. It is a very complicated problem. But also a ton of fun, good fun to be able to do this kind of stuff. But first, let's talk about what this has to do with you. So this is, again, that employee life cycle that we saw before. Maybe we want to understand how these things are relating to each other. Can we look at one piece of this cycle and use that information in order to predict what's going to happen later in the cycle? So I want to talk a little bit about, that would be more of a supervised sort of thing. If you have people who are later in the cycle, you can use their data from the past in order to understand what those relationships might look like, and then apply that information that you learn to people who haven't made it to those points yet. So you don't have their information yet, but you're able to predict something about it in the future. So that's kind of a supervised approach. And an unsupervised approach, I'll just tell you a little bit about one project that I did where I was looking at how people at one particular company for one particular survey were responding to the question, the expectations of me at work are reasonable. And I used an unsupervised approach of taking this data. We've got hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people who are replying to this question. They're typing out a response in the little box. Maybe we don't have time to read thousands of responses, but we want to know generally what people are talking about. So in order to approach this problem, I used an unsupervised natural language processing technique to pull out some topics or some themes about what that content would say. And you'll notice, looking at these two word clouds, so I chose two topics in this case, broke it out into two topics, and you'll notice that there are a lot of words that sort of overlap. Team appears in both, for example. I believe time also, or perhaps not. But there are a bunch of words in there. Reasonable appears in both, for example. So there are a number of words that appear in both, but the size of the word is telling us something about the importance to that topic. So in topic 0, this one includes words like role and department and expectation that are quite important, as opposed to topic 1, which is quota, time, reasonable, and balance. So going based off of that, as well as I'm able to, with this sort of thing, pull out comments that are especially representative of each topic. So you pull those out and be like, okay, I see these are the words that are important for this topic, and here are some examples that match this topic really, really well. What do I think this topic is going to be about? So based off of those words and based off of the examples, topic 0 tends to be things like your expectations about me within my role, within my department, or alternatively of my role, the expectations of my role and my department. And then topic 1 is more about what the impact of my responsibilities, for example, quotas, are on my work-life balance. And both of these things are topics that are falling within the expectations of me at work are reasonable. So we can use things like unsupervised techniques to help us understand these sort of unstructured data sets in order to understand what's happening in them. And then we don't have to read all of them individually. Okay. So that was a little bit about what you can do with the data, and now I think we have a little bit of time to at least talk about the conceptual part of this, which is about where you are now and where you plan to go in the future. So conceptually, where you are and what the resources or what the maturity of your company looks like right now. Your company or the subset of your company, which is HR. Okay, and I think the most important part of this subset of the talk is about the strategy and making sure that when you're thinking about data and HR data and building an HR data plan, that you are rooting it in not just the strategy of HR, but linking that back into the strategy of the company overall. So that's staying grounded so that you can really go the distance and then be able to link that back. So for example, let's say that you're at a company that has an overall strategy of something like grow in a particular market, or deliver amazing products, or innovate, or beat the competition, or give first-in-class customer service. Whatever it happens to be, whatever your company does, and whatever the overall strategy is for the company, how does HR fit within that? And how is data going to help you succeed in doing that? So when we think about how HR is going to be able to help a company do something like innovate or deliver an amazing product or any of these things really, ultimately we're asking, what do people have to do with solving this problem? And I really think the answer is people have everything to do with solving most problems. In many ways, people are the most important asset of a company. So what you do in order to make sure that that you are getting top talent and you are retaining top talent, and not just that, but making sure that people are bringing their A game to the office every single day, how are those things going to play into innovation or beating the competition or whatever it happens to be? So when you're thinking about building your strategy, what I really wanted to emphasize here is making sure that you understand what the overall strategy is for the company and linking that back into what people have to do with that play and how data is going to help you solve that problem. So, for example, if you're going to come at it in terms of bringing your A game, you might want to think about things like performance and engagement and the things that can help you enhance performance and engagement. And where are you going to get data on that? Where are you going to be able to pull information about performance? Maybe you have a performance management tool, and maybe you have information about talent or how talent moves within your company. Do you have information about how which people have been tagged in order to be able to receive additional training because they're expected to be leaders in the future? Like, do you have anything like that you might be able to connect up with performance information to help you bring this back to questions of innovation or products or that sort of thing? And I know that this is kind of a vague and tricky problem, and I don't have time necessarily today to dig into all of it, but I also think that it's a really important one for HR in particular, because often with HR, you're going to have a variety of stakeholders who, at all different levels, who are coming to the table with a variety of different needs and interests. And that's a little bit different than anybody else in any other area of the company. So when you're thinking about how to defend a strategy in order to make this case about why it's important for you to have these resources or to have access to this data or what have you, you're going to have a much more ironclad case than perhaps other people in other areas of the business. So in some ways, this is a very special challenge for HR, I would think. Okay, I'm going to skip ahead because we're starting to run short on time, and I want to make sure that there's plenty of time for questions. So I'm going to jump ahead to, and I did touch on it, so let's jump ahead to the special challenges of HR. And the first most obvious one to me about this is literally everything. HR in and of itself is a special challenge because you are sitting at the intersection of doing what is important for the people in order to support people at your company and what's important to the business, and how you can deal with having these stakeholders on the business side who are pushing you in directions while also supporting the people in order to make sure what's happening for them is correct. So that in and of itself is a very, very special kind of challenge. And balancing that back and forth is going to be a very special kind of challenge. Getting into the data, though, a special challenge about HR data is the sensitivity of it. You're going to have, because it's data about people, you're going to have different kinds of constraints than you will in other areas, or other people will in other areas of the business. So this has to do with what are the security restraints that you have to deal with and the restrictions on who is able to view that information, as well as legally, what are you allowed to collect? What do you have to purge? What systems do you have in place in order to be able to purge that? And all of that needs to be thought about in a different way because of the sensitivity of this data. So again, a very special challenge for HR. Other special challenges have to do with the way that you use the data and the way that you take action on it. So a really important one, and this one is something that I think about quite a lot, is about the potential for the propagation of bias. And what do I mean by that? I mean that data itself, when we're collecting it from humans, we're seeing things as they happen. We see the behaviors as they are happening. And we as humans are biased creatures. We bring those biases and they come out in our behaviors. So if you fit a model, if you were doing machine learning or what have you, that is based off of the data and doesn't take this into consideration, then those biases are going to be expressed in the results that you get. This can be a huge, huge problem for data scientists to be able to approach. And there isn't necessarily an easy solution to it, except to be thinking about it, thinking about where you're getting your data, how you're going to be using that data, and making sure that you have a diverse enough team thinking about this data. Again, coming back to this idea that it is an interdisciplinary sport. That if you have enough voices at the table, then you will hopefully have people raising all of the red flags that you need to in order to be able to identify where you're likely to see those issues. So that, I think, is a really, really important one when we start thinking about it. Another one is the way that you're using it in terms of the way that you're telling that story. So essentially what I was just talking about was ethics in data. And I think that most people on this call probably have a strong feeling for the ethics, and because a lot of people get into HR, they seem to get into HR because they care deeply about people. But that doesn't mean that you're not going to have a CEO or what have you leaning on you in order to go in a particular direction or think about things in a particular way. So you're going to be using this data and telling the story of that data in a way that is both balancing the ethics of the situation while also advancing the business. So in some ways, this is coming back to that previous point about how you're going to have multiple stakeholders who need different things from you. Again, very, very special challenges of HR. And the last two things I want to talk about, the first is that you're going to have have confidence in using the data itself, which can be a little bit tricky because you may not have all of the resources that you need in order to get at this. And again, I want to bring it back to the idea that depending on where you are as a business, it may be good enough to just be looking at it in terms of the analytics. What happened, without asking why, or asking more specifically about it. That doesn't mean you shouldn't be looking into the future. Just think about and where you want to go as a company and as a part of a company, but thinking about what do you need in order to solve your problems today, while also keeping an eye on tomorrow for what you're going to need to do in order to be able to get there, and really leaning on that circle of excellence that you have or that you can build in order to start solving these problems. And the last point is about usage and action and employee trust. So this can be really tricky for HR because you don't want the people at your company to feel like you're big brothering them. You want to make it clear when you're doing things ahead of time, proactively making it clear what you're going to do and how you're going to do it and why it's going to benefit them, so that they don't feel like they are being leaned on in a way that infringes on them as people, because that's obviously not going to be good for anybody's engagement, and then that's, counter to your goals. Okay, I've talked a lot about a lot of things. We talked about data science. We talked about data science and what it has to do with HR. We talked about how to develop a question. We talked about analytics and advanced analytics and predictive analytics. And then we talked a tiny little bit about strategy and what that has to do with HR. And what I'd like you to take away from this is really that data science is interdisciplinary, that you should always start with a question, really root in that business question so that you know where you're going to go, and it's going to lead back into things that are really, that are going to be useful and insightful. We talked about how metrics are measurements, they aren't the strategy themselves, and we also talked about how to build some metrics. And we talked about some of the tools and in order to be able to get real answers to those questions that you have with advanced analytics. And we talked about how predictive analytics opens up this additional cornucopia of options that you have to look at data that maybe you haven't had or couldn't look at, or gives you new capabilities for what you could do in the future. We didn't get to touch on the big data maturity models, but we did talk a little bit about strategy and moving the path forward. So if nothing else from this talk, I hope you take away that data science is a team sport and we're playing in an interdisciplinary field. There's room for everybody in this field, and in fact, we can't win if you aren't there. We talked about clarifying ambiguity by rooting those projects in business questions, and we talked about how rooting in strategy is really important to be able to make sure that all of these different stakeholders are going to be on the same page and accepting of what you want to do in the future. So with that, thank you so much for listening. I hope you learned something. I hope you had some fun. I hope you laughed along with me, and hopefully not too much at me, but I'll be accepting of the latter as well. And with that, I will pass it back to Mike.
And we will turn to audience questions in just a moment. SHRM thanks Achievers for sponsoring this program and SHRM's series of free webcasts for the HR profession. Achievers' employee success platform delivers proven employee recognition, continuous learning, listening tools, and timely coaching tips for organizations to give their people ownership of the employee experience and to drive organizational success. To learn more, visit achievers.com. Okay, let's turn to some of the questions that are coming in. Start here. Audience member writes, it has been my observation that many HR professionals choose HR specifically because it historically has been the least quantitative discipline in business administration. How do you recommend overcoming the widespread innumeracy, data illiteracy, and general fear of math that seems to pervade this profession?
Right. Yeah, I think that's a fair question. I think that in some ways you're right. I think a lot of people get into HR because they really care deeply about people, and that's where their heart and soul really is, and that's not necessarily, that doesn't always lead to the same kinds of skills. So how to approach this problem, I think, is to, again, lean on the circle of excellence that you've got in order to be pulling from those areas, and to seek out the people within those groups who can become champions. So I think that, so pulling a little bit on the past here, I think that a lot of people, regardless of what industry they're in or where they're going, I think a lot of people develop a lot of fear about math and approaching math. And that leads to people really freezing up and making assumptions about what they're going to do, or what they're going to be able to understand. So even though you're going to present something in a way that's really friendly and really easy to understand, before they've even gotten there, they've already shut off. And I think that that's a problem with comfort levels. So I almost want to say that at this point you need to be leaning on some ideas around validation and psychological safety, and being able to create that space for those people who are going to just shut off so that they don't shut off, or if they have shut off, to be able to get them to turn back on again. And what can you do in order to support that person through what they're probably not viewing as anxiety, but is probably rooted in anxiety? Like, how do you support that person to feel like they are capable of dealing with that? And in my experience, again, this has mostly been through a lot of validation, a lot of making sure that they understand that that questions are welcome, and breaking it down as many times in the most friendly ways possible as they need in order to be able to make it through that. So really holding their hand through it, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. But I think the most frustrating thing about the situation you're describing is when they don't come to the table at all. If they come to the table, we can definitely make it work for them. But if you don't come to the table and you're not really willing to have that conversation, then there's not really a lot that you can do. So I guess you work with what you've got is what it comes down to. I'm sorry if that's not, it's not a silver bullet in any way, but it is a complicated problem to say the least.
Continuing with our audience questions, what are some of the most popular data relationships that companies most often use for analytics? For example, onboarding to retention, training and development to retention.
I mean, I can't speak too much about what people are doing. Well, I can a little bit because relatively frequently people come to me with a question and they want to be able to do it on their own, and I'm just helping them to figure out how to approach it, and then I often give them the content that I've just given you, but in a more personalized way. But anyway, usually when people are coming to me, it's because they want to understand the relationships between things like engagement or the specific things that they are trying to do in order to affect engagement, and what those things what those relationships are. So, or alternatively, people also often ask me about what the relationship is between engagement and turnover. That's a really, really popular one, whether or not your engagement predicts whether or not you're likely to leave a company. I think that for me personally, those are the ones that I hear most often, but that may not necessarily be the most important thing to a particular company or a particular HR team within a company. It may not be the most important thing to them at that time, but by the time they come to me, it's usually about something to do with engagement or recognition.
Continuing with our audience questions, a viewer writes, if you have raw data, what is the best recommendations to start creating a predictive model?
I think the thing that you start with is the baseline analytics, really understanding the data that you've got. Explore it in as many ways as possible. Do you have zeros in there? What do those zeros mean? Should they be excluded, or are those zeros actually really very informative about what's going on? Then the next thing that you need to start thinking about is what are your features going to be? So that's what your variables that are important to understanding this are going to be. So you can start doing a little bit of looking at these variables individually with relationship to what you're trying to predict in order to see whether or not there are relationships there. Are there some relationships there when you look at it in one way or another way? Do you have to cut it in particular ways? Do you need to use something else in order to create additional information on top of it, like breaking it up into specific categories, that sort of thing? So looking for relationships so that you can use that to determine whether or not it makes sense to use as a feature at all. You can also pull from the substantive expertise aspect of that when thinking about this too. So if you're trying to understand engagement and you find that there's a correlation with height, maybe that's not useful information really. Like maybe it's there, and if all you care about is engagement, then you might want to put that in there, but maybe if maybe you're pulling from the things that you know as a professional are likely to be useful, and that can tell you where to look within the data that you've got, or it can tell you that you need to look elsewhere for additional data sets in order to really get at what you want to ask. So yeah, those are the first couple of steps that I would take, are understanding the data that you've got and understanding the relationships in the data that you've got so that you're able to decide what features to include in your predictive model. Then the next step would be to start thinking about what kind of predictive model you want to use. Are you going to be looking at a decision tree or a support vector machine? Are you going to try a neural net? What are you going to do? And ideally, you could try a couple of different things and use the constraints in the data that you've got. So what are you trying to predict? Is it a binary outcome that you're trying to predict? Is it not a binary outcome? Do you have a lot of data? Is the data really sparse? Which means that you've got a lot of zeros in it. Those are all things that can help you decide what kind of model that you want to use. I'm a big fan of decision trees, to be honest. I think that they're really cool, and I think that they're very robust. Support vector machines are also quite robust. So I would probably start with those two things as a place to go in order to see whether or not it's working. So that's how I would start.
All right, continuing with our questions, do you have any guidelines for when to use pulse surveys and when to use longer or less frequent surveys. I'm considering how to measure employee engagement and employee buy-in to a culture change.
Right. Great question. I think that longer form surveys, what can I say about this? I feel like longer form surveys potentially have a place, but I think that having more frequent information, like a pulse survey that's short and to the point, is a little bit more important when you're thinking about change, or just anything really, because engagement is something that is happening so quickly. It's changing so quickly that if you do a long form survey and need to be able to roll out the resources and have everybody sit down and take the time for that and all that entails, that's something that you're only going to be able to do a little bit less frequently. But if you're doing a shorter pulse survey, then you're able to understand what's happening in a little bit more real time. And particularly when we're thinking about change, that seems especially important. What does the landscape look like before it's happening? Like, what does normal fluctuations in engagement look like in your population over time? Before the change begins to happen? What does it look like during the change, and what does it look like as the change is starting to solidify, as things start to settle down? So I would say that it's probably a good idea to be aiming towards a pulse survey so that you get data on how things are happening in a little bit more real time. But I think that if you don't have the resources to do that, if you could get one survey before and one survey after that is a longer form survey, then that's better than nothing, at least. But I would, if it were up to me, I would go with a pulse survey.
And let me just squeeze in, we're up against time, but a couple of folks have asked questions along these lines. What's the best way for someone working in a company that doesn't have an analytics focus to learn more in terms of personal and career growth? Another audience member asks, how do you recommend learning how to do analytics if you're interested in doing so on your own?
Great. Excellent questions. I love it. The first thing is you're in the right place. You talk to people like me and you come to things like this. But also there are a ton of online resources that will help you get you started. You could enroll in a course on Coursera. There are a bunch of things like this if you just Google it. But you don't even need to enroll in a course necessarily. You could also read blogs. You could be taking online tutorials. There are so many just free resources on the internet that can help get you going. But I would also do things like go to meetups, go to events in your area where there are going to be people there who are going to be able to answer your questions. And that's really important to make sure that you aren't getting stuck in a particular mindset, that you aren't looking at a problem from just one very narrow perspective, because that could lead to you getting insights that aren't very informative. So the more that you can talk to people to enrich what you're pulling from, the more likely it is that you're going to be able to get some really good, solid insights. So I guess those are my recommendations. Look for resources online, either formal or informal. You could also take actual formal courses. Like, I guess that didn't even occur to me initially, but yeah, you could definitely go take a university course or a college course on this kind of thing. And talk to people. Go to courses or webinars like this in order to get external perspectives and be able to ask questions. Great question. Thank you. All of them were great questions. Thank you, all of you.
And with that last question and answer, we're going to bring today's webcast to a close. Before we sign off, a couple of final thanks. First to our presenter, Tanya Stemberger from Achievers. Thank you for the insight you shared today. And we want to thank our audience for taking part in today's program. That concludes this webcast.